So welcome to this series of dialogues for the Pocket Project between Thomas Hübl and special guests. And today we're delighted to welcome William Ury. William is a co-founder of Harvard's program on negotiation. He's the co-author of the world's best-selling book on negotiation, Getting to Yes, and the author most recently of Getting to Yes with Yourself. William has served as a negotiation advisor and mediator in conflicts including the Middle East, Yugoslavia, Chechnya, and Venezuela. During the Cold War, he helped the US and Soviet governments create nuclear crisis centers designed to avert an accidental nuclear war. Over the past 5 years, William has worked as a senior advisor to Colombian President Santos on ending a 52-year civil war, the last war in this hemisphere. One of his great passions is bringing people together across cultures and faiths by creating a long-distance cultural walking route through the Middle East, known as the Abraham Path. This was the subject of a popular TED Talk entitled The Walk from No to Yes. Thomas Hübl is a contemporary spiritual teacher. He brings the radical fire of the timeless wisdom traditions into a modern context. And his work embraces both the highest levels of consciousness and also the most wounded, the most traumatized levels of consciousness as well. And he's already run many large-scale projects dealing with collective trauma, particularly with Germans and Israelis. And the Pocket Project is a new initiative that he's created to really take this work with collective trauma, collective shadows, onto a more formal and more global platform with training and enabling groups worldwide to work with collective trauma. So, William, a warm welcome to you. And I'd like to begin by asking you to start with the first question, which is something around in all your work in hot conflict areas. We're very interested to know, first of all, what you see as the symptoms of trauma in these areas, these zones, and then also how much you see that there is a kind of recycling of trauma as a part of the conflict that you work with.
Well, Nicholas, it's a pleasure to be speaking with you and with Thomas. And, I was trained originally as an anthropologist, and so I'm always keen to studying human beings and how we relate. And to me, the passionate question that's been guiding my work is, how can we human beings get along with each other in the midst of our very, very, very deep differences? And so that's led me into, as you mentioned, hot zones around the world, conflicts, where you see some of the darkest and most destructive human impulses revealed. And so when you ask me what are the symptoms, I see a lot of deaths. I've just been working in Colombia where there's been 220,000 deaths. And you can imagine for every single death, how many people are wounded, and the circles of trauma for all those societies, for the victims. There's an estimated 8 million victims in Colombia, out of a population of about 50 million. And the question is, I tend to work in the area of, as you know, of negotiation. So I've been working at the, with the president and his close advisors and the negotiators and with the FARC, which is in some ways removed from the actual, the villages, the communities on the ground. But I can tell you that trauma, which takes the form of just broken lives, takes the form. It takes the form of people who can't move on with their lives, who are mourning, who are grieving. There's so much disruption And it also leads to a kind of, interestingly enough, it can lead to a kind of desire for vengeance. Although what's really, I think, interesting is that we just had, there, as you know, in Colombia, there was an agreement and there was a plebiscite on the agreement. And to everyone's shock and surprise, the no vote narrowly edged out the yes vote. And then the day after the vote, there was a map done of where the yes votes were and where the no votes were. And it turned out that the areas that were most traumatized by the conflict were the areas that voted yes for peace. And the areas where they were less feeling the trauma, they hadn't really felt the effects of the conflict in maybe 10 years or 15 years, were the ones that more freely voted in opposition to the agreement. So we've had the paradox of the people who've suffered the most from the conflict. And I'll just bring it down to a single story. I just came back from Oslo, where the Nobel Peace Prize was given to President Santos. And there were a number of victims there present at the ceremony, very touching and very moving. And one of them was a man who, in a violent exchange between the FARC and the paramilitaries whom they were fighting, a FARC bomb fell on a church in which the villagers were huddled together to take refuge. And in that church perished this man's father, his mother, and 3 siblings. And yet he has found it in his heart to be able to forgive. And he came there to Oslo to announce his forgiveness. And that's not just an isolated incident. I think, that's what's so curious in the town where he came from, where that town where 150 people died in that incident. That town voted overwhelmingly in favor of the peace agreement. So I'm wondering here in terms of your question here, but I would say that I would just come back to saying that I think trauma is an extremely important part of all the conflicts that I've been involved in. And I feel like we're at least in the world, we're in the infancy of thinking about and figuring out how to deal with that collective trauma so that conflicts do not get repeated. And Colombia, to me, is a very good example of that, too, because the conflict has been repeated for 52 years. And even before that, if you look at Colombian history, there was only a short interval. And before that, there was another period that they called La Violencia, where another few 100,000 people died. So there's probably not a person alive in Colombia who actually knows what it actually is to live in a society that's at peace. So dealing with that, finding ways to deal with it, because we can negotiate agreements, but those agreements are only sustainable if there's an acceptance and integration of that by the community, by the people. Right now, for example, in Colombia, we're facing the challenge of we've reached an agreement, and the agreement is about to be implemented. But to me, the agreement is only the midpoint of the process, because the whole implementation process, and that implementation process will take the collaboration of millions of people, and those people, a great number of them, maybe a majority of them, are people who have suffered trauma. And the question is, how does it actually get implemented, not just agreed at a negotiating table in Havana?
That sounds amazing to me. First of all, to hear your life experience being in the midst of all of it, so that you're talking really out of your actual experience. And therefore maybe I will ask a little bit more according to this. For example, how are your experiences with negotiating between parties that are severely traumatized often, and how do you see the trauma playing out in a negotiation versus mediating conflicts that are not based on a heavy trauma of two parties? So maybe sure you had the difference in your life, you could witness the difference in your life. And so maybe you can elaborate a bit, because I think that's very interesting to see how trauma, or even collective trauma, where it's culturally already kind of held in a cultural container, will play out in human beings finding agreements.
Yes, I think that's true. I mean, what I see is there's a deeper emotional layer in conflicts where there's a lot of collective trauma. And, one thing I can see, just again, that you're making me reflect on in the Colombian peace process, the negotiations which we helped get going were taking place in Cuba, removed from Colombia, and they were taking place, I wouldn't say in a rarefied atmosphere, but certainly removed from the struggle. And one innovation that has never taken place before in a peace process, to my knowledge, that at first was initially kind of resisted as, oh, this is going to distract us and take up a lot of time and so on, was the idea of actually inviting groups of victims to come to Havana to testify to the negotiators on both sides about their experiences, and to be heard, to be listened to. Not just by the negotiators, but in that sense, because the media was there, by all of Colombian society, and the victims would release statements. And these victims were selected carefully by the United Nations, by national universities, to reflect a kind of a broad array of the many different kinds of victims. So there were victims of the FARC, there were victims of the government, there were victims of the paramilitaries. The majority of victims, interestingly, were women. And the voices that, there was a fear, I think, that this would take because there were a number of these delegations that went. I can't even remember, but it was somewhere on the range of half a dozen or a dozen delegations of victims. So it took place over the course of a year. And there was a fear that, this would be a big distraction, or there was a fear that the victims would be, calling for vengeance, and it would actually stir up things, and it would stir up emotions, and it would make actually the negotiations more difficult. But I can tell you that, in fact, it proceeded in a very different way, which is the great majority of the victims basically made statements saying, we need an end to this conflict. And we are prepared to forgive even. Not to forget, because there's a big difference between forgetting and forgiving, but to take initial steps towards forgiving, that we need to move on. And so, to everyone's surprise, the victims played an enormously constructive role in giving impetus, in reminding people of the deep wounds, but in a way that didn't set the process back, but actually advanced it and actually clarified for people what this was actually about. It wasn't just words. We're talking about real lives and alleviating real suffering and stopping the suffering. Because there are a lot of people, even, very well-intentioned people saying, well, we have to have real justice here, and we have to put the FARC in jail and all of that, which of course would have brought the negotiations almost to a complete stop, because the FARC had not been defeated, and there'd never been a peace settlement in which the guerrillas had freely agreed to lay down their weapons and go to jail. But actually, it was interesting that the victims were among the strongest voices for a restorative approach to justice rather than a punitive approach to justice. And all of that was very much based on kind of listening and bringing attention to the trauma, rather than, as many people felt like, we have to forget the past. Let's just forget it. Let's not deal with it, because if we go there, it's too dangerous. We'll never get out of that morass.
So what I hear is that the listening and the compassion, like feeling for people and people's traumas, has been a way to open up the negotiation on a deeper level. So when people really felt what the consequences are of the actions and the war and the kind of atrocities that happen in wars, so that opened up the negotiation platform. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely, and it did open up compassion. I think it opened up people's hearts. It touched people's hearts. Of course, the stories of the victims, and I would say this was the first victim-centered peace process that I've either experienced or even known about. It went further. I mean, there was something of that ilk, for example, in the South African peace process with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But that took place well after the agreement. This is something that was taking place in the midst of the actual negotiations itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sounds to me like an amazing approach. So really kind of well done.
Well, it's a beginning. It's a beginning, and and I feel that humanity, we're just learning how to deal with these, and we're still very much in the infancy. And that's why, the insights and perspectives that people such as yourself bring to bear, I think we're in a stage where we can innovate, and we need innovations in how to deal with these collective traumas so that they just don't keep on repeating themselves as negative repetitions throughout history. And Colombia is a very good example. It happens to be fresh on my mind, but you see the same thing. I've been working a little bit on the sides of the Syrian conflict, where so much trauma is being created, and wondering, how do we deal with all of that trauma? Or I was in Myanmar and Burma, where also this decades of trauma of a war that's been going on for 60 years in that country, between 17 different armed groups and the military and the government. And the question is, how do we heal? How do we heal these wounds so that they don't just result in endless cycles of violence?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's anyway something that I would love to discuss with you. What you see when we say, I will just set a bit of a context to my question, and then I come back to this, because the latest research, like also in epigenetics and genetics, show that there is an impact of trauma on our epigenetic environment. Most probably also, as it seems, that trauma causes DNA damages, and that through trauma therapy we are able to in a way restore that to a certain extent. And so when we say, in a way, what's written in the Bible, that the sins of the fathers will be passed on to the sons and the next generations. And in a way, it seems like that we more and more reveal that that's actually true. That's actually true, that we literally, through our bodies, pass on kind of atrocities, trauma, overwhelming experiences, and it's in some way will have to be carried on and processed later on. And that's also what basically, in my understanding, is the notion of karma in the Far East. So that when we say there's a kind of a carry-on luggage from one moment to another, when it's a small disturbance, and the two of us have an argument, and then we both think 1 hour later about our argument, that's a small portion of it. But if that's a Holocaust, if that's a crisis in the Middle East or in Colombia, that's much more severe. And I'm very much interested, what's your take on how do we actually take care as human beings? How do we care for our life base in a way that we see, our actions and our ethics and our way of living is inherently interwoven with our well-being, with our health, with the health of the next generations, and that we really have also a responsibility, like we need to respond somehow to the stored information in the one human body or in the tissue fabric of life. And so I'm very much interested, what are your thoughts? How how can we take care of what we actually produce as human beings, like how we harm the tissue of life, and the scars that are in the big body of life. How can we take care of this without again and again needing to go through the same experiences in order to restore the trauma?
Good question. To me, the word that comes to mind is the word dignity. That there's something, and in my experience, there are these moments when people show fundamental human respect to the other, and respect in that Latin sense of to see again, respect, to see the human being within. And to me, that was something that we set from the very beginning of the peace talks in Colombia 6 years ago. I set that as kind of like, that's the key word here, is respect, dignity. And with the notion that somehow, as we experiment with that, of how we try to show respect to individuals, that somehow has some kind of healing power. Very gradual, very slow, and sometimes actually not so, but it's like that you can see someone. And that to me is manifest, for example, in the power of apology. I mean, right now, for example, in Colombia, we have, FARC leaders and government leaders going to places like where that massacre took place in that church and publicly apologizing. Mm-hmm. When that happens, you can hear a pin drop. Mm-hmm. I remember once, just as an example, many years ago, I was facilitating very quietly and confidentially a conversation between Turkish leaders and Kurdish leaders. As you know, the whole conflict there between the wars that have been going on and the violence has been going on for so many decades, and it was hard even for them to sit in the same room together. For some of them, I remember, or to really even listen to each other and hear what the story was, because there had been thousands of villages that had been devastated by this conflict. And at one moment, I remember there was a retired admiral, Turkish admiral, who got up and said, I just want to say something. I just want to personally, just personally, as a member of the Turkish armed forces, I want to acknowledge and apologize for all the suffering that innocent villagers have experienced as a result of the war and the actions of the armed forces. Well, when he said that, you could hear a pin drop in the room. There was an intense silence, a moment of silence and kind of surprise. And then spontaneously, one person started clapping, and then the whole group started clapping. And that was a tiny moment, but it was a moment when I felt like there was a psychological shift in the room, a psychodynamic shift that allowed us to, because there had been so much heaviness in the room beforehand, and that it's not magic, but it shifted something, and then we were able then to come around and talk about how both groups could cooperate to produce a more productive dialogue back in Turkey, and that power of a human apology, I think, that's sincere and that's from the heart to victims cannot be underestimated. And it all comes back to somehow seeing the other, acknowledging the other, and acknowledging their basic human dignity, because a lot of these traumas are violations of people's dignity. What they do is they create humiliation. And I have a colleague who's interviewed murderers on death row, or murderers in jails, and to try and find out what's the common theme. And he said the most common thing he found in the motivation was a sense of humiliation, was that humiliation is behind a lot of violence. And so how do we cleanse humiliation, which is the trauma, if not by showing someone fundamental human respect?
Yeah, that's beautiful. Because that's also one of the visions of the Pocket Project, is what is actually the work that we end up naturally in the willingness or in the deep need to say sorry and to apologize. I think that's a natural consequence of a process that's being brought to a certain level, that we feel so reconnected to each other that the fabric of life or the tissue of life actually has again a feeling awareness that we are not separate, but that we are interrelated. So that's a natural consequence of a felt sense of the other and the natural care. Yeah, that's beautiful. And I think we all know this from intimate relationships or from any kind of personal relationships that are not now war zones, but how important it is that we can say or receive sorry, and that's a deep acknowledgement and a deep healing in itself. So yes, that's a beautiful principle. And the other thing that I hear, because we might think, okay, if we can just forget and just move on, that's a way to deal with trauma. But actually, what we hear just in this first part of our conversation is that it seems like to really acknowledge the trauma and to really give it a space and hear it and really hear it and receive it is a crucial part of actually not trying to get on, but include and allow for a restoration. I think that's something that I take from your experiences that is, I think, a key aspect in restoring our world, basically.
Yeah, that's it. It's I love the way you talk. You have a kind of vocabulary, and this is what I think we need. The beginning of an anatomy or a vocabulary for how we talk about a process that has been, we don't even have words so much to describe what happens. Because I've witnessed it, but in terms of being able to really describe what actually happens, even in the scientific way, as you're talking about epigenetics, but what actually is happening in a biochemical, genetic, psychological, spiritual, just as the process of peace is being made. I mean, it's interesting to me. I mean, one thing, there are these moments. I mean, there's a kind of, having been in many of these rooms between arch enemies and, peoples who have killed, people have blood, either have blood on their hands or their people have blood on their hands. In those rooms, when they come together, there's often a kind of electricity. There's almost like a magnetism. And in those moments when you make progress, when those little breakthroughs happen of acknowledgments, of apologies, of ahas, then there is a moment of as you put it, that's when Einstein's famous, optical delusion of separation kind of dissolves for a moment. And there's a feeling of interconnectedness, and that the other is not different from the self.
Right. And then as you say that, I'm curious, what's your take on the role of the mediator, like yourself, in the room? What's the kind of consciousness ingredient that you bring into a room that you think is vital for two parties or more parties that actually more or less do not want to speak with each other? Like, what is the ingredient that you bring in as a mediator, negotiator, kind of facilitator of such a process, that seems to be the thing that works. So what is the magic kind of dust or the ocean that you bring into the room, whatever that is, that seems to make these movements towards each other possible? Can you describe a bit what's your
Sure.
thing about it?
I will. Just before I do that, I know there's just a story that popped up in my head, just triggered by the last thing you were saying, which was that, back to that conversation with those Turkish and Kurdish leaders. There was a Turkish leader who had been a member of a kind of a violent group called the White Wolves as a student, and they were almost like a death squad. And he said he would rather, kill a Kurd than talk to a Kurd. That was, that's, and, this fellow, I remember when he heard the word Kurdistan, which it was like, he said it was such a violent thing, even hear that word. It had a violent effect. He just immediately rose and left the room and said, "I'm leaving. I can't stand it. I can't be here and hear a phrase like that." So he was in that state, and I had to, and maybe this goes back to your question, go out, find him, talk with him, and persuade him to come back in the room, to stay in the room. And I think that is one of the roles of the mediator, the third party, is to hold that container, because there's so much energy in that container, and the forces are centrifugal forces that are and you have to kind of create that container. And it may not be one person, it may oftentimes be a group. That's why I think of it as the third side, a third side container, but it's you're holding that container. So my role was to bring him back into the cauldron in which we're trying to, like ancient alchemists, to turn the lead into the gold. We have to kind of keep people in that container to allow it to happen. Well, he came back in there, and stayed, and then over at breaks they were listening. And that night, he got no sleep whatsoever. And he woke up the next morning, and in the opening session, he asked to speak. He said, and he described his own experience. He said, I heard things that I'd never known before about the experience of the other in this case. He says, if you told me before this meeting that I'd be coming to a meeting with Kurds and talking about a thing like Kurdistan, I would have thought I was living in my worst nightmare. But now, having spent the whole night up, I actually believe I'm living in a dream. And, he'd gone through by holding him, by allowing him to stay within that container, he'd gone through some transformation. Just an intense transformation, because he had been confronted with having to include the experience of the other in his known universe rather than just his own perspective. And I think that's what a good third party does, is it's not, I used to think, it's about your words, and it's about the things you say. And that's true. Words are a very useful instrument, but it's much more about even if you're quiet, you're totally silent, there's a presence there. Interaction between the two parties is very different when a third party is witnessing it, and witnessing it from a perspective where the parties trust those external witnesses. They don't feel judged by those external witnesses. Those witnesses are listening. They create a container which then can hold things when someone feels like leaving the container or destroying the container or whatever, because there's something very explosive, it's like one of these chemistry experiments. You have to kind of create the right container, because you're putting two elements that have incredibly opposed. It's like a nuclear, kind of a nuclear, could be a nuclear explosion. So there's a whole question of how you create that container, maintain that container, so that the process, the interaction of the elements can happen in its own way. And a lot of, to me, the work of the mediator is getting out of the way. You're not, because sometimes people think the mediator's in there, they're saying, you should do this, you should do that, here's the solution. That's not it at all. It's much more about creating the container in which the parties do the magic themselves.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. So what I hear is that your capacity, in this case, your capacity to hold a space, a present space, to provide a present space, but also to be so attuned and connected that you can find in a way into moments that seem shut down or when a person wants to leave. So I hear actually amazing qualities that we can train, like everyone can train in a certain way, but the specialists for certain, hot conflicts have to have, is in a way, as you said, I like the silent presence, like a conscious awareness of witnessing. And I love this notion of witnessing, which leads me to another question that I am exploring also, is what is actually the power of enough of us witnessing, but truly witnessing with a felt sense of awareness and energetic connection, that more and more people will actually, and I think that's also pretty much part of your work, like the third party for our life's or global stage. So I'm wondering what happens if more and more of us will really turn towards the events that happen instead of being part of it by turning away. So when we read news, we might easily turn away because we say, oh, that's so awful. I anyway have so much to do in my own life, so let's get on with my own life, and then I cannot be bothered by that. Which on the one hand is true, we all have lots of things to do, but if we join most probably the large majority of us not witnessing really the world events, so we actually part of it, I believe. But I think there is a power in creating a global, what we call global social witnessing, like that part of our responsibility to be a global citizen is to develop a kind of a witnessing capacities that we see. As you say, respect is to see again, but actually that we see again what is happening right now. So when we say, okay, there's trauma, there's collective trauma work, so where is all the energy of the Holocaust? So how is that suppressed in our collective unconscious, and what are the effects through generations that we need to deal with? So that's one thing. But the other thing, I think, and they are of course interrelated, is what is our capacity to witness the atrocities that, like Syria, as you mentioned, or in Colombia, and any other place that is now in difficult situations. But not only that, it also applies to our closest community, like the neighbors, or like in our own city. But this interest that I believe being a citizen of a world comes with a witnessing responsibility. I think we have the responsibility to be part of the third party naturally. And I would love, when I'm just kind of talking a bit about my thoughts about this, but maybe you have some responses to that out of your own experience.
I do. It's music to my ears, what you're saying. I really do think, I think right now, as an anthropologist, I've gone around and studied lots of societies, and learning from the most indigenous societies, what are their methods of resolving conflict. And to me, what I see them use is they, in a way in which we do much less, is they deploy the power of the community, which is what I call the third side. And that third side plays a role, like, if they have a conflict, I watch this among the San Bushmen, for example. They have a conflict. Two individuals get into a heated conflict. Well, someone goes and hides the poison arrows out in the desert so it doesn't escalate into violence. And then they all sit down in a circle around the campfire. The men, the women, the children, everybody in the group. And they kind of witness the conflict. And it's not exactly, it doesn't always look so, it's not like everyone's just quiet and silent, or whatever. It's people are talking at different times or whatever. There's some pandemonium there, but there's a witnessing of the whole society, of the society takes responsibility for the conflict. Conflict is not just regarded as the responsibility of the two individuals, the parties as we think of it, but it's the ability of the community to respond. And to me, the very first, so I see that happening, and it's very effective, because within that circle, within that container, then the conflict gets transformed, and not just arrive at a settlement, but you have to arrive at a basic reconciliation of the people. The relationships need to be healed. It's not a question of just finding the right solution. It's the relationships, the fabric needs to be knit back together in some way. And to me, the challenge that I see facing our globe right now with 7 billion people plus is how do we recreate that third side?
Right.
For conflicts ranging from the small conflicts, with our neighbor to, the nuclear conflicts. And to me, the primary function of that third side is to be the witness, I like to use the metaphor of go to the balcony, because from the balcony you observe things. Like things are going on a stage. You go to an emotional, mental, psychological balcony overlooking that stage. It's a place of perspective, a place of calm, a place of clarity that you know very well, of course. And to me, there's a paradox that in being able to detach yourself and go to the balcony, you're actually better able to engage and empathize with the parties. So in a funny way, by detaching, you become one. It's not, and I think that's, I love it when you talk about how, when we disengage from the news, we're actually participating in the process. We're a participant. But if we can more mindfully go to that balcony, and witness and presence and be present to whatever is happening, whether it's the conflict with our neighbor or whether it's the conflict in Syria, if we can train hone those natural human capacities on a collective scale and hone our abilities to be a third side, which is the ability to me to go to the balcony, the ability to show empathy, to empathize, which is again an innate human capacity. If we can develop that from the balcony, you take the sides of all the parties, and it's not like but it's an observation without judgment. It's from the heart, and then so to me it's balcony, empathy, and then the third element of what you do on the third side is you reframe. You kind of you reframe it in terms of the whole. And how can we all together as a community move forward, deal with this, heal the wounds? And it's an inclusive movement. And those skills to me and those competencies, which are innate in human beings, if we can develop them more globally, collectively, then I think we have a chance to be able to bring about the world we'd like to live in.
So I totally agree with you. It's lovely. And so I wonder how do we initiate something like a naturally growing third side? Like how do we induce in more and more of us, like in ourselves, and maybe it's inspiring for other people as well, that there are more and more people in the world that say, okay, and I see, I witness, I feel. And of course, what we will come up against is are the effects of the collective traumatization of the past. So the carry-on luggage of all the wars and all the atrocities that we are still carrying within us that are untaken care of, they will limit our capacity to witness. They will limit our capacity to empathize. So they will limit our capacity to feel. And even like they will make us much more turn away than naturally. But I believe like that if we see the necessity that actually in every global citizen, there is a responsibility to do at least a little bit, whatever is possible for us, if it's in the closest neighborhood or if it's in the global context, but that we really have that. I envision the more people really presence in, as you said, in a mindful, heart open way, the world's process. So the more like the space will have eyes all over, so that less and less atrocities can go by unwitnessed. And I think then they will be harder to be like to be done, because it's if you feel somebody that is very present with you, it's even hard to lie, because it's like it's hard because you feel like if somebody is looking through you, is feeling you, it makes it harder. But if you have an unpresent person on the other side, so it's much harder because anyway there's less awareness of the process. And I think if we were to generate a world community, and of course it will take some time, but I think that's third side. I love this principle that you bring in. Is something that I think is a global citizen responsibility, like in many other things that like the same how we pay our taxes or how we participate in everything that we have to as a citizen, that we also have a kind of a caring for our common life base, for the tissue of life, I think. Yeah,
that's it. That's exactly it. You and I share the same vision. It's the and I think it is a learning. We're actually moving in this direction. The question is, how do we accelerate this kind of global learning? And it does take to cultivate the third side, which is the side of the whole, right? It's the side of the whole that includes everyone, includes the full parties, and it's for the benefit of the whole. And if we can do that, if we can learn that, and you're right that the first work begins inside of ourselves, because we have to deal with our own traumas. If we have to kind of clean our own lenses if we're going to be able to see or to let our light, help others in that sense. And so the first work is work within, but it's fundamentally work that will serve the whole. And then, even if I think about sometimes I'm thinking about, so how do we do this? I mean, how do we do this at a scale that is the requisite scale to deal with the challenges that we face today? Because to me, ever since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, ever since the explosion of the nuclear weapon, which was kind of a signal moment when humanity, before that we'd had lots of conflicts, but we never had the ability in our conflicts to destroy the entire system of life. And so at that point, there began a race between our technological capacity to destroy and our moral, cultural, spiritual, emotional, psychological capacity to find ways to heal our wounds, to live together, to work together, and to deal with our differences in a constructive way. So there's a race going on. And the question for me is, I see the technologies developing, but where are the technologies for mass human healing, for mass human witnessing, at the scale that's required? And I wonder whether or not, for example, some of the new technologies, the social technologies that didn't exist when I started working on in the field of conflict, there was no internet. There was no, we now have the ability, and I'm wondering whether, if you imagine a Venn diagram where we could actually use these social technologies through social media and the internet, use them, the new methodologies for collective healing, for collective witnessing, and a systems understanding, like 3 circles of technology, methodology, and systems. And systems, I mean, going to the roots of things, like the roots of the trauma, and looking at prevention, not just cure, but how do we systemically, holistically deal with the system? That in the inner circle of that Venn diagram of those 3 circles, if we were to imagine, for example, like right now, we have Airbnb, for example, or we have Uber or whatever. And what do those things do? Airbnb didn't build a single hotel. Uber didn't build a single taxi. All they do is ask people who are already out there. They make everyone a potential taxi driver or everyone a potential host, like an innkeeper. What if we did the same thing for conflict and created a platform in which everyone is a potential third sider? Because everyone does this. Everyone has, in their own families, they're doing it. They just don't recognize that that's what they're doing. But if we gave them that recognition and they began to have the tools to be able to do the work to be a good and a very productive third sider, then you could initiate a global movement in which, because I don't think it's going to be solved by just a few well-trained, highly skilled people, like my colleagues or whatever, just going, yes, that's needed too. But those are like neurosurgeons, but we need, you need a whole health movement. So everyone needs to be engaged. And I think we need to take that same kind of thinking that we're using in technology and apply it to these challenges of how do we get the collective healing of trauma and the collective creation of better ways of living together and dealing with our differences and solving our problems together. If we could do that collectively, then I think we have a chance to win that race.
Right. Yes, I'm totally with you. And I think that what you're saying is with the technology, that I think definitely the technology is the accelerating factor in it. And definitely I think it starts with creating campaigns exactly what you said, the simplicity of being a third sider, that's something that everyone or almost everyone can be part of and can perform, and that we can train. I think these are things that can be part of a project, literally to spread through the social media. I think that's definitely doable, and I think that's definitely like scalable. And I think if we combine that, like the call, because I believe that democracy is going to work only if we call it a democracy still, or if it emerges into something new, I don't know, but that if every one of us is a mature citizen. So the more regressive I am, the more I externalize my stuff, and the more I wait for them to do it instead of me taking responsibility and participate. So that's the basis. So if we know that the global conflicts won't be solved by our governments, they won't be solved by institutions, but they won't be solved by all of us. Like that we are part of that responsibility, we are part of that intelligence. I think if it is becoming more and more clear, then also less and less energy will rest with those governing institutions. I think also less and less corruption is possible, because if the energy is owned in this whole system, the energy is also in the right place. And I think if then that's a very powerful thing that you spoke to. How do we induce the witnessing, the global witnessing, that as a capacity? And I think if we combine that with the collective trauma work, that we see how much, we call it life energy, is being invested already in shadow agreements. So that many parts of our language are already based on the itness of the shadow. And because we talk like that, we already have made an agreement. So it's already frozen in our cultural agreements. And I think we have to unlock some of the givens that we have been born into already, and take for real. Recently, I said in a group in the States, yeah, but why do we accept that we live in a world that we take as a given that there are losers or winners? And we talked about the election, and I said, what is actually the effect of after the election that maybe half of the population does like a disengaging, a disappointment, a disengaging, kind of an unplugging in a place of losing.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering about this gap that happens when we sink back into our chair, we disengage in a way, instead of staying engaged with our creativity, even if I feel disappointed, sad, whatever, angry, but I stay engaged and I don't unplug my creativity and I pull out, but I stay there. And I think you most probably experienced in many crucial situations that staying there was a vital change for the situation, because you could have pulled out, but it would have been the worst decision, or the less kind of productive decision for the process, I'm sure.
That's it. That's exactly it. It's, to me, it's, in terms of choices that we face when we have a conflict or conflict situation, we can fight, and try to win. we can submit, and just accommodate and, okay, we lost, whatever it is. We can avoid, and I can disengage, and just kind of like, okay, I'm going to disengage. Or we can engage.
Right.
And engaging has the assertiveness of fighting without the aggressiveness.
Right.
Engaging has the flexibility of accommodation without the submission. And so it has a little bit of the detachment of avoidance without the disengaging. So there's a kind of mindful, alert, somewhat detached, witnessing engagement. That's what's needed. Because sometimes the engagement, so it's in that sweet spot that I think if we move in that direction and say, and bring our curiosity and say, well, isn't that curious that this happened? And then, without being attached to an outcome, but being very clear about our intentions and our aspirations, having high aspirations and no expectations. If we can move into that space, then we can engage with that phenomenon. We can dance with it. We can dance with those shadowy forces that we think of as, or we brand as the enemy. I've been reading, actually, after the election, I've been taking a lot of solace in reading Lao Tzu. And he has a lot of wisdom, of course. And there is one thing where he says that, the greatest misfortune you can have is to underestimate your enemy, which is to treat your enemy as evil. That's what it means by underestimate. Treat your enemy as evil. You don't really see them, right? You don't see who they are. You don't see the human being there.
Right.
And if you do that, you lose the three treasures. And then somewhere else he talks about what those three treasures are. And those three treasures to me are key to this, which are, the first one is simplicity, which is, being in accord with the ground of being in alignment, being mindful in that sense. And the second is patience, being patient with both friends and enemies, which is, again, in accord with the way that nature is. And then the last is compassion, because if you can be compassionate for yourself, you can help reconcile all beings.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Yeah, I think I totally agree with you, this staying engaged. And I think staying engaged also brings up another competence onto the game board, which is like the capacity to feel discomfort. Like when I feel shame, when I feel anger, when I feel like stuff that I don't like to feel, or when situations are tense, or when I feel very disappointed, like after my sense of losing, whatever losing. So how to host those feelings in myself and stay connected to my surrounding or my environment. I think that's a key, also in the spiritual practice, a key element of staying present with all of the 360 degree of being a human being. And it also brings me to another question that my sense is that in order to work effectively with collective trauma, because it's something collective structures in consciousness are still is something that we have been born into, we have been programmed by. So a lot of our interior wiring is through our social and cultural environment. And so that to become aware of and to be able to witness and to awaken from our cultural identifications and collective identifications is a big thing, I believe. And so if we then think about the stuff that is culturally unconscious, it's even more complex. So I believe that the spiritual training or practice, like of a deep inner awareness, like the work that we do on our own, like within our own trauma zones and our own stuff, but also like an inner connection as a resource, as a compass in the moments when it gets dark, when it gets difficult, when it gets challenging, I think are key. And I would love to hear a bit from you how you see the aspects of the spiritual practice, or maybe your spiritual practice, that are key in like key competencies today in your work and in working with trauma as well.
Yeah, for sure. When I first began in this field of helping people, my passions, helping people get to yes, people would say, okay, yeah, but I want to get to yes, but there's that difficult person, those difficult adversaries, that difficult neighbor, that difficult spouse, that difficult child, and whatever. So I spent years actually thinking about, okay, how you deal with difficult people or difficult situations, which are, the extreme situations. And, but over the years, it dawned on me actually that the most difficult person we ever have to deal with, the person who really gets in the way of us getting what we want in a negotiation, is not the person on the other side of the table. It's the person right here on this side of the table. It's the person we look at in the mirror every morning. And so that began a whole, and I realized that, as a mediator or as a negotiator, what's my, it's like you're like a musician where your instrument is yourself. It's not about, if I can influence myself, then maybe I have a chance of being able to influence the other. And so much of what we think of as negotiation, we have these images a little bit like that are captured in that old fable of that argument between the old Greek fable of the argument between the north wind and the sun. You know that one? Where the north wind and the sun were up in the sky and they were having a big argument about who was more powerful. And they couldn't resolve the argument, so they looked down on Earth and they decided to set a challenge to see who was the most powerful. And they watched there was a wandering shepherd boy with his sheep, and he had a cloak. And they decided, the most powerful one will be the one who can rip that cloak off the shepherd boy's shoulders. So the north wind goes first, and he blows and he blows and he blows. And that shepherd boy, the more that he blows, the more the shepherd boy wraps that cloak around his shoulders and doesn't let go. And after, half an hour, finally the north wind has to take a pause for breath. And then it's the sun's turn. And the sun takes a very different approach. The sun just bathes the boy in warmth. Beautiful, warm day. And the shepherd boy says, it's such a beautiful day. I think I'm going to lie down and just enjoy the sun, take a sun bath here. He lies down, and as he lies down, he takes the cloak off his shoulders. So the sun wins. And to me, what that reveals, that fable, is two fundamentally different ways of influence, right? One is the north wind approach, which is the one we think, okay, I'm strong, I bring pressure. But the more pressure you bring to bear, the more you treat the other as an inanimate object, then the more that person resists. And the sun takes a very different approach. They don't try to force the boy. They just try to create an environment in which the boy, as a living being, decides of his own free choice that the best thing to do is to take off his cloak.
Beautiful.
And to me, that has to do with, and it goes back to your question about spirituality, to me, that sun approach, which is, how do we create that environment in which others naturally do things that contribute, to the whole? And that work begins first within ourselves, of course, by learning to reflect that sun inside on ourselves and take that sun approach towards ourselves, which is, instead of repressing negative emotions that we don't want, repressing anger, repressing fear, repressing jealousy, repressing hatred, and so on. You take the sun approach. You just, you show compassion towards yourself, like Lao Tzu was saying. You understand, you listen to yourself. How can we possibly listen to the other, which is the key to dealing with trauma, is to really listen, not just to the words, but to the human being there, to the heart. How can we possibly listen to someone if we haven't first listened to ourselves? Right. Because if we haven't listened to ourselves, then we're going to be distracted by all, we're just going to hear with a tiny bit of our being. But if we've done that internal spiritual work, that psychological work, that deep healing work with ourselves, then we can be a little more of an empty vessel, and we can receive something. We can actually listen to someone. We can create that container as a third sider, and then we can really serve the whole. So for me, the spiritual work, which a lot of people sometimes think is, go off to a cave and it's kind of like you're withdrawing from the world, is actually the most engaged work you can do with the world.
Beautiful. Yeah, I fully agree with you, and I'm so happy to hear you speak out of your rich life experience and your own the humility of your own inner work that I hear throughout this conversation, and the beauty of the flowering of the capacities, and that I also hear that the deep inner clarification work and presencing work and inner connection is actually a way to develop competences in the world that are deeply engaging, restoring relation, and enabling us to contribute even more in a sustainable way. So that sounds all great to me, and I really enjoy this conversation, and I think we should really deepen the conversation maybe another time on this topic of global social witnessing, or the third side, or like creating a movement. I'm thrilled by the idea of creating a movement with all the kind of technological capacities that we have available, how to induce that our world will have eyes all over, or presence, or hearts all over, or however we call it, but this kind of engaged witnessing, like how to induce that. I think that's on the way to a more healthy life base. I think that's a crucial key factor. So I would very much love to deepen this notion and this approach, and see if we find ways to collaborate on that. I'm definitely in.
I would love that. Because I really see that's there's so much potential there that we have yet unleashed for us to come into our full selves and be these global witnesses. Because to me, having spent 40 years on a quest for the secret of peace, I've come to the conclusion that the secret of peace is us. It's both within us, in that deep psychological, spiritual work that then allows it to be all of us. It's the community coming together. So it's to use, to make use of the new technologies, the new methodologies, to really go to the roots of conflict, to the traumas, into prevention, into healing, on a global basis that's at scale. It would be a joy to be able to collaborate on that with you, Thomas. So I look forward to the next conversation, and count me in.
Fantastic. And I love that when you, maybe the last thing that I was contemplating a lot about the fake news and people complaining about the media, and then I thought, isn't it interesting that basically the best communication, and I'm sure everybody knows this out of his or her own life, the best communication you have when there is connection, when there is relation, when we are engaged. All of what you said before is basically the foundation of relation. And I believe relation is the basis for communication. If you have a good internet connection, so then the data is, the emails are just coming in. If the internet connection is kind of so then we are waiting for a long time to get our emails downloaded.
That's true.
And I think in the best prevention and the best communication on a global level is when we are interrelated, as you said. And I think that the best prevention of fake news or all kind of tendencies that create fragmentation in the world, splitting, mistrust, and kind of deeper isolation is actually when people come together to relate. So I think what we talked about is a kind of a very, very much needed remedy. So let's continue this conversation.
I'm very grateful for you for the conversation, and I look forward to collaborating on this, because I really feel that this there's magic here, and there's magic to be able to unleash the magic that's inside every human being.
Right. Thank you so much, William.
Thank you, Thomas.